The courtroom was silent when the black judge suddenly interrupted the proceedings. His attention was drawn to a 2-year-old boy, abandoned on the streets. Without waiting for the case to finish, the judge made the decision to intervene immediately and save the child. This act stunned everyone in the room. What happens next? Let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to catch more exciting stories. The courtroom was typically a place of calm and order, where every word spoken held weight, and every decision was meticulously calculated. But on that day, everything changed in an instant. The judge, a tall and imposing black man known for his unwavering professionalism, sat at the bench, focused on the case before him. He was the embodiment of authority, his presence commanding respect in every corner of the courtroom. The case was important, but nothing could have prepared him for the sight that unfolded before him. The sound of the door creaking open shattered the silence. A young boy, no more than 2 years old, stood in the doorway. His wide, frightened eyes scanned the room as if he had wandered in from another world entirely. Dressed in ragged clothes, his tiny hands clutched a tattered toy, his body trembling in fear. The boy was alone. No guardian. No adult to look after him. A ripple of shock spread through the courtroom. Murmurs began to rise as everyone turned their attention to the child. The judge's stern demeanor cracked as he locked eyes with the boy, a look of confusion and concern flashing across his face. His gaze never left the child, and without warning, the judge stood up abruptly, interrupting the ongoing hearing. His commanding voice broke the rising tension. "This case will be adjourned immediately," he announced, his tone unwavering yet filled with an urgency that stunned the room into silence. All eyes were on him as he descended from the bench, crossing the courtroom floor with deliberate steps. His usual calm and measured approach was replaced with something more urgent. The child, lost and alone, needed help, and the judge couldn't turn his back. The proceedings of the court, the lawyer's arguments, and the case at hand seemed insignificant compared to the child's immediate need. The judge knelt down in front of the boy, his eyes softening as he reached out a hand. For a moment, the room stood still, as though the very air held its breath, waiting for the judge's next move. The child hesitated, but something in the judge's gaze seemed to reassure him. Slowly, the boy took the judge's hand, his tiny fingers wrapping around it as if seeking protection. In that brief moment, the judge felt a deep connection to the child, an unspoken understanding that this was not just a coincidence. Something greater than the courtroom drama had taken hold of the judge's heart. He had been called to act, and there would be no turning back now. As he stood, holding the boy's hand, the judge looked toward the bailiff and issued an order that would change everything. "Make sure this child is taken care of immediately. We'll deal with the details later," he said, his voice firm yet filled with compassion. The murmurs in the courtroom continued, but no one dared to question the judge's decision. He had broken protocol, disrupted a critical case, and shifted the focus of the entire room. But in that moment, no one doubted that he had done the right thing. The hallway outside the courtroom was eerily quiet, the air heavy with the weight of uncertainty. The small figure of the boy stood against the cold, sterile walls, his tiny body trembling. His once clean clothes, now dusty and torn, clung to his fragile frame, evidence of his harrowing journey to this strange place. His wide, innocent eyes scanned the corridor, filled with fear and confusion, like a lamb lost in a world far too big for him. The boy's heart raced in his chest as he looked around, hoping for a sign of comfort, but all he saw were unfamiliar faces, too busy with their own lives to pay him any attention. The cold tile beneath his bare feet seemed to echo his loneliness, a constant reminder that he was completely alone in a place that felt both foreign and unwelcoming. A single tear rolled down his cheek, quickly wiped away by his small hand. He sniffled, his tiny sobs barely audible, as he clutched the ragged toy in his arms. It was all he had left. The only piece of his past that hadn't abandoned him. The toy, though worn and frayed, was his one connection to something that had once been his comfort. Without it, he might have felt even more adrift, but even with it, the terror of the unknown gnawed at him. He had no memory of how he had gotten here. All he knew was that he had been left alone. His mother? She was nowhere to be seen. His father? There was no sign of him either. He didn't understand the world he had been thrust into, but he felt the overwhelming sense of being abandoned, of having no one to turn to. The door to the courtroom remained closed, the muffled sounds of voices beyond it now a blur. He had been brought here by some unseen hand, led into a room where he didn't belong, left to wait in a cold, lifeless hallway. The boy's hands tightened around the stuffed animal as he slowly sank down against the wall, his knees pulled up to his chest. He stared at the floor, the feeling of isolation settling deeper within him. What would happen to him now? Where would he go? The questions swirled in his mind, but there were no answers, only silence and emptiness. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to close his eyes, as though to escape the harshness of the world around him, but the ache of being alone never left. Time felt like it had stopped, the minutes dragging on like hours. The boy wasn't sure how long he had been waiting, but each second felt like an eternity. He had been given nothing, no reassurance, no sign of comfort. All he had were his fears, gnawing at him from the inside out. Just then, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, the sharp click of heels on the hard floor drawing closer. The boy's head shot up, his heart pounding in his chest. Was someone finally coming for him? Or was he to remain forgotten, a lost soul in a world of indifference? A figure appeared in the doorway at the far end of the hall, a silhouette that seemed to shine with authority. The boy didn't know who it was, but in that instant, he felt a strange sense of hope stir within him. Someone was coming. Someone was finally going to help him. Or so he hoped. The judge stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the small, crumpled piece of paper he had just uncovered. It was a simple note, hastily written, and yet it felt as though it contained the weight of 1,000 unsaid words. He carefully unfolded the paper, his large hands trembling slightly as he read the hurriedly scrawled words, his heart heavy with the realization of what this note represented. The ink was smudged in places, as though tears had blurred the letters, but the message was clear. I am not well. I cannot care for him. Please, whoever finds this, take care of my son. He is all I have left. Please love him as I have. The judge's eyes lingered on the final words, each syllable echoing in his mind as if the mother's voice itself had spoken them to him directly. For a moment, the world around him seemed to disappear. The clamor of the courtroom, the coldness of the legal proceedings, everything faded away, leaving only the raw emotion in the note. The mother's plea was not just a request, it was a final act of love, an act of desperation born out of her deep, unyielding desire to ensure her child would be cared for, even after she was gone. His fingers tightened around the note as he read it again, each word sinking deeper into his soul. The gravity of what he had just discovered hit him like a wave, crashing over him with overwhelming force. This wasn't just a legal case, it was the story of a mother who, despite her own suffering, had still cared enough to think about her child's future. She had faced her own demons, her own illness, and had made the ultimate sacrifice by letting go. The boy's mother, in her final moments of strength, had reached out through the only means she had left. The judge felt a deep pang in his chest as he realized the significance of her actions. She had given up everything, her health, her life, and now her child, because she loved him enough to let him go, to trust that someone would take care of him when she could no longer be there. The judge looked at the boy, who still stood in the hallway, his tiny frame trembling with uncertainty. He couldn't fathom the depth of what this child had endured, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he could not turn away. The boy's future, fragile and uncertain, hung by a thread, and that thread was this note. For a brief moment, the judge closed his eyes, taking in a shaky breath as he tried to compose himself. But it was impossible to ignore the tears that welled up in his eyes. The weight of the responsibility was suffocating. He had been faced with difficult decisions before, but none like this. His role as a judge was to uphold the law, but today, in this moment, it was his duty as a human being that called to him most. As the courtroom waited in tense silence, the judge carefully folded the note, his hands steady despite the emotions that raged within him. He knew what he had to do. This was no longer just about the law. It was about giving this child a chance at a future, about honoring the wishes of a mother who, despite her own pain, had given everything for her son. The boy was no longer just a case, he was a living, breathing connection to a past filled with love and sacrifice. The judge walked over to the door, the note held gently in his hand, and looked down at the child who had been left in the hands of fate. In that moment, he made a silent promise. He would do everything in his power to make sure this boy would have a future filled with love, care, and the protection he deserved. The judge would become the father the child had never known. The courtroom's silence deepened as the weight of the moment settled over everyone present. What had started as a legal case had now become something much more profound, a testament to the power of love, loss, and the fragile hope that even in the darkest of times, a new beginning could emerge. The atmosphere in the courtroom had been tense, the air thick with the sound of legal arguments and the murmur of the gathered crowd. The judge had been silently listening, his stern face betraying no emotion, as the proceedings continued around him. But the note, the one he had just read, had ignited something inside him. A sense of urgency, a responsibility that he could no longer ignore. As the prosecutor continued speaking, outlining the case at hand, the judge's mind drifted back to the child standing just outside the courtroom. The image of the frightened little boy, alone in the hallway, clinging to the edges of his own uncertain world, gnawed at him relentlessly. Every word from the prosecutor seemed to fade into the background as his thoughts consumed him. Without warning, the judge's hand slammed down onto the gavel. The sound echoed through the room, silencing everyone instantly. All eyes turned to him, stunned by the sudden disruption. He had never interrupted a hearing before, especially not one as important as this. The courtroom, which had been buzzing with legal jargon just moments ago, now stood still, waiting for him to speak. His voice, when it came, was firm but laced with an underlying emotion that caught the entire room off guard. "This hearing is adjourned," the judge declared, his tone leaving no room for argument. The words hung in the air like a heavy weight, their unexpected nature reverberating through the walls of the room. Gasps filled the courtroom, as the audience, the lawyers, and even the defendants exchanged confused and incredulous glances. No one could understand what had just happened. The judge, in the middle of a case that many had assumed would take hours, had just brought it to an abrupt halt. But the judge wasn't concerned with their confusion. His focus was entirely on the child. The note had torn away any doubts he had, and in that moment, he knew there was no more time to waste. He had to act. His voice broke the stunned silence once again. "The child outside, he is in immediate danger, and I will not stand by while a life is at risk." The words were met with shock and disbelief. The prosecutor stood frozen, unsure how to respond, while the defense lawyer's mouth opened and closed in stunned silence. Everyone had been trained to respect the courtroom's protocol, to trust in the process, but here, in this moment, the judge had placed the child's welfare above all else. His decision was clear, he could not wait for the case to conclude. As the judge stood, his gaze hardened, a resolve in his eyes that no one could mistake. "I will take responsibility for this boy. I will ensure that he is cared for, and I will not allow this court to continue until I know that he is safe." He turned away from the bench, walking toward the door where the child had been waiting. His movements were calm but purposeful, a quiet confidence that only comes from a person who knows they are doing the right thing. The courtroom remained in stunned silence, as people began to realize that the situation had taken a turn none of them could have predicted. This was no longer just a matter of law and procedure, it was a matter of humanity, of compassion, and of the judge's deeply held belief that the boy deserved a future beyond his abandonment. As the judge reached the door, he turned to face the courtroom one final time. "This court is adjourned," he repeated, his voice ringing out with finality. "And I will not stand idly by while a child's fate hangs in the balance." With that, he left the courtroom, his decision final, his mind resolute. The murmurs behind him began, the whispers of confusion and disbelief filling the room. But the judge, now more than just a figure of authority, had made his stand. And there was no turning back. He would see this through, no matter the cost. The judge sat alone in his chambers, the weight of the decision pressing heavily upon his shoulders. The courtroom had cleared out hours ago, but his mind could not rest. He kept seeing the little boy's frightened eyes, the same look that haunted him during his years on the bench, a look he had seen too many times in children torn from their homes, abandoned, or lost. The image of that child standing alone in the corridor, clutching his small teddy bear as if it was the only thing left connecting him to a world that had turned its back on him, refused to leave his mind. He had never imagined he would find himself in such a position. As a judge, his life had been governed by rules, by procedure, by impartiality. But this was different. This child was not just a case to be judged. He was a life, a fragile, innocent life, that needed someone to step up, someone to care. The judge couldn't look at the boy and pretend he was simply another story of abandonment. He had seen enough of that throughout his career. But this child, this boy was different. His gaze moved to the note again, the one that the boy's mother had left behind. It spoke of her illness, her inability to care for her child, her final plea for him to be loved and cared for. As he read the words for the third time, the judge's heart clenched with a deep sorrow. This woman, facing the end of her life, had made a painful choice, one that no mother should ever have to make. But she had asked for help, for someone to step in and provide what she could no longer give. She had put her trust in a world that had failed her, and now it was up to someone to carry out her final wish. The judge could no longer deny it. He could no longer turn away. He had the power, the authority, and, most importantly, the will to change the life of this boy. He would not let him fall through the cracks like so many before him. This child deserved a chance. A chance to be loved, to be cared for, to grow up in a world where he mattered. And that meant giving him more than just temporary shelter. It meant offering him something deeper, a future. The decision came to him with clarity: he would adopt the child. He would give him a family. The judge had no hesitation in making this choice. He knew it would be difficult, that it would change the course of his life in ways he could not yet understand. But it felt right. It felt like the only thing he could do. The process of adoption would be formal, of course, and there were legalities to navigate, paperwork to be signed, and all the usual steps that came with such a profound change. But in his heart, the judge had already made the decision. The boy would have a home. A place where he could feel safe, where he could heal, and where he would know that he was loved. The judge would not be just a figure in the courtroom anymore. He would become the boy's protector, his father, the one who would guide him through the difficult and uncertain world ahead. The weight of the decision did not scare him. Instead, it filled him with a sense of purpose he had not felt in years. He was no longer just a man behind a bench, he was a father now, and that realization shifted everything. There was no turning back from this path. The next morning, the judge formally filed for adoption. The paperwork was routine, but his heart raced as he signed his name at the bottom of the forms. This simple act of pen on paper was a promise to the boy's mother, and to himself, that he would not let this child be another forgotten statistic. As the adoption papers were finalized, the judge's chambers became a different place. It was no longer a room for legal rulings and decisions of the law. It became a place of hope, a place where a new chapter in both of their lives would begin. And as the judge stood, looking out the window, the weight of responsibility settled comfortably in his chest. He had made the right choice. The boy, with his wide, curious eyes, had found a future that no one could take away from him. The judge smiled to himself, the first true smile he had allowed himself in weeks. A new life was beginning, and it would be a life filled with love, safety, and a chance for something better. The judge sat in his office late into the night, the only sound the rhythmic tapping of his pen against the wooden desk. The weight of the decision he had made lingered in the air, thick and heavy. It wasn't just the future of the child that haunted him, but his own future, the life he had built for himself, the career that had defined him, the principles that had always guided him. He had never once wavered from his duty to the law, his commitment to maintaining order and justice. But now, faced with the plight of a 2-year-old boy who had been abandoned, he was forced to confront an entirely new kind of justice, one that wasn't found in books or statutes, but in the depths of human compassion. His heart ached for the child, yes, but it also ached for himself. What would happen to his reputation? To his career? He had a position of power and respect, one that others envied. What would the world think of him, the judge who had interrupted an important case to save a child? He had never questioned his actions before, but now, as he sat alone in the quiet of his office, doubts crept in. Would he be seen as a hero? Or would he be castigated, ridiculed for letting emotions cloud his judgment? He could hear the voices of others in his mind, the whispers of colleagues, the murmurs of the public, the opinions of those who would never understand. How many times had he heard people criticize those who stepped outside of convention, who took risks for the sake of doing what was right? How many times had he been the one, sitting in judgment, looking at the actions of others with a detached eye, never once questioning his own decisions? Now, it was his turn to be judged, to decide if his duty to the child was greater than the career he had worked so hard to build. But as he thought of the little boy's face, wide-eyed and scared, standing alone in the cold courtroom corridor, he felt a rush of clarity. This was no longer about public opinion. It wasn't about appearances or professional obligations. It was about doing what was right, what was just, and what was human. No amount of career advancement or reputation could outweigh the responsibility he felt in that moment. He stood up from his desk and walked over to the window, staring out at the city lights below. It was late, the streets almost deserted, but in the quiet of the night, he felt the weight of his decision. It would be risky. There was no question about that. Adopting a child wasn't a simple decision, let alone one made by a judge in the public eye. He would be scrutinized, perhaps even criticized. People would question his motives, his judgment. But did that matter? What mattered more was the boy's future, his well-being, the chance to give him the love and safety he had been denied. The judge exhaled slowly, releasing the tension that had been building inside him. He knew there would be consequences, there always were. But he also knew that he couldn't ignore the call in his heart. The boy needed him. And more importantly, he needed the boy. This wasn't just a decision about adoption. It was a decision about morality, about justice, about what it meant to truly serve the people he had sworn to protect. Turning back to his desk, he made up his mind. He would go forward with the adoption. He would follow his heart, regardless of what the world thought. In the end, it was the boy's future that mattered, not the judgment of those who would never understand. The judge knew that he would have to face the consequences of his actions, but he was ready. The paperwork would begin tomorrow. He would make sure the child would be safe, loved, and cared for. This was no longer just a case, this was a life. A life that he would now help to shape, a life that would no longer be left to chance. And as he set the pen down on the desk, the decision made, the judge felt something that had eluded him for a long time: peace. He had chosen to act with his heart, and no matter the outcome, he knew it was the right choice. The following days were filled with tension, as whispers of the judge's decision to adopt the boy spread throughout the courthouse and beyond. In the days after his public act of compassion, the courtroom became a battleground not just for justice, but for the deep-rooted prejudices that simmered beneath the surface. It wasn't long before murmurs began to rise among the judge's colleagues, and the once respected figure now found himself facing open criticism. Some spoke in hushed tones, shaking their heads in disbelief. How could he, a respected member of the judiciary, make such an impulsive decision? There were others, though, whose voices grew louder, their condemnation sharper. "He's overstepping his boundaries," one lawyer said, his words laced with disdain. "What right does a judge have to adopt a child in the middle of a courtroom? It's a disgrace. He should have followed procedure." But it wasn't just the logistics of the judge's decision that provoked such resistance, it was something deeper, something darker. The fact that the child was black, and the judge himself shared the same racial background, caused a ripple of discomfort in some circles. Racial prejudices, long buried and carefully hidden behind polite exteriors, started to rear their ugly heads. In private meetings and conversations, certain individuals voiced their discontent more openly. Some questioned the motives of the judge, suggesting that he had only made his decision out of some misguided sense of racial solidarity. "Perhaps it's guilt," one person remarked, as if the judge's actions could be reduced to some personal flaw. "Maybe he felt the boy's pain because he understands it too well." Others whispered that the judge was simply trying to make a statement, to prove a point about race and society. They couldn't fathom that someone in power could act solely out of compassion, without ulterior motives. Within the courtroom, the air had shifted. As the days passed, the judge began to notice the subtle change in the way his colleagues looked at him. Some avoided eye contact, while others spoke to him with thinly veiled skepticism. The quiet looks of disapproval were enough to make him feel like an outsider in his own community. Even the support he had received from some quarters now seemed frail, as if it, too, was weakening under the weight of public scrutiny. Outside the courtroom, the situation was no better. News outlets caught wind of the story, and the narrative quickly shifted from a tale of kindness to one of controversy. On one hand, there were those who praised the judge's compassion. But on the other, there were harsh critics who claimed that the judge had put personal emotion above the rule of law. His decision was now being seen as both a moral stand and a professional misstep, depending on who was speaking. For the boy, the constant spotlight became a heavy burden. Despite being a mere toddler, he could feel the tension in the air, the cold stares, the hushed conversations that followed him wherever he went. Though the judge had promised him a safe and loving home, the world outside seemed intent on questioning their relationship, focusing on their skin color and disregarding the fact that a child needed love and care, not political debate. Some of the resistance came in the form of legal challenges. Those opposed to the adoption found loopholes and technicalities in the law, hoping to undermine the judge's decision. Arguments based on the judge's potential bias, the idea that he might not be fit to raise the child due to his over-involvement in the case, were thrown into the mix. The child's future, once so hopeful, now seemed clouded with uncertainty. The judge himself was not immune to the pressure. The accusations and the doubts weighed heavily on him. He questioned whether he had been foolish in thinking that one person could make a real difference, whether his desire to do good had clouded his professional judgment. The world around him seemed to demand that he explain himself, justify his actions, defend his heart's decision against an avalanche of criticism. But the judge knew, deep in his bones, that he had done the right thing. He had saved a child. He had offered the boy a chance at life, a life free from neglect and fear. And that, to him, was more important than any opinion or societal norm. Yet, the road ahead would be hard. The fight was far from over. In a world where prejudices ran deep, the judge knew that overcoming them would require more than just courage, it would require resilience, both in his actions and in his spirit. As the resistance grew, so did the judge's resolve. Despite the obstacles in his path, he would not let prejudice, skepticism, or fear rob him of the chance to give this child the life he deserved. The battle for justice had only just begun, and the judge was prepared to face it head-on, no matter the cost. As the judge's decision to adopt the child became public knowledge, it was not long before the tidal wave of criticism began to build. Within the walls of the judicial community, once respected colleagues began to whisper behind closed doors. The questions about his motives became louder, more insistent, and were now being broadcast for all to hear. What had seemed like a moment of compassion was quickly being redefined as an act of recklessness. The first murmurs of discontent spread among his fellow judges. While some were outwardly supportive of his decision, the majority viewed it through a much more critical lens. The idea that a judge would abandon his professional detachment to intervene in such a personal matter was seen as a breach of the role he had sworn to uphold. "He's supposed to be impartial, not a savior," one senior judge said, his words thick with disdain. "You cannot allow your emotions to cloud your judgment. This is not a charity. It's the law." Behind the scenes, there were calls for an investigation into whether the judge had violated any ethical standards. His decision to take the child in without the usual channels or bureaucratic processes seemed like a dangerous overstep. To many, it felt like an abuse of power. The idea that he had simply acted on a whim, without regard for the proper legal procedures, was a central focus of their concern. Then, the media caught wind of the story, and the public outcry exploded. The headlines that followed painted the judge in two distinct lights, either as a heroic figure who had stepped in to save a child from a life of neglect, or as an arrogant man who had abused his position of power for personal gain. The newspapers, once neutral, now fell into the trap of sensationalism, with each article exploring a different angle, often focusing on the judge's race and motivations. The press quickly fixated on the fact that the judge and the child shared the same racial background. Was this an act of altruism, or was it rooted in some deeper need for redemption, some unspoken desire to right wrongs that had haunted the judge for years? Some reports claimed that he had taken the child in only because of shared racial identity, insinuating that his decision was not about the child's well-being but about an emotional tie rooted in his own past. This line of thinking ignited a firestorm of debate, with critics saying that a child's future should never be influenced by such personal feelings. The public condemnation also touched on the social and political landscape. Some saw the judge's actions as an affront to societal norms, questioning why such a public figure would risk his career to take in a child who had not even been legally placed with him. "If a judge can make such a reckless decision, where does that leave the rest of us?" one prominent political commentator asked. The conversation surrounding the adoption shifted from a discussion of the child's needs to an indictment of the system itself, of how a man in a position of power could suddenly decide that personal intervention was more important than the law. Meanwhile, the people who had once admired the judge began to distance themselves from him. There were murmurs that his career might be on the line, that such a breach of protocol could lead to an investigation into his conduct. Speculation about the consequences of his decision was rampant. Could he lose his position on the bench? Would his professional reputation be irreparably damaged? In a profession that thrived on decorum, the judge had not only challenged the status quo, but had also placed himself at the very center of a controversy that was rapidly spiraling out of control. The pressure mounted. Every day, it seemed, there was a new headline, a new article questioning the judge's actions. He was being labeled reckless, irresponsible, and even unprofessional. The image of the judge, a stern, poised man who had been a beacon of integrity in the courtroom, was now being eroded by accusations that threatened to bring everything he had worked for to its knees. His colleagues, who had once regarded him with admiration, now treated him with suspicion. At home, the judge faced his own battles. While he remained resolute in his belief that he had done the right thing, the weight of public opinion began to chip away at his confidence. The walls felt like they were closing in. His family, his friends, and even his mentors questioned whether his actions had been hasty or even naive. Was he really capable of raising a child on his own? Could he give the boy the stability and love he needed when his own career hung in the balance? Through it all, the judge tried to remain focused on what truly mattered, the well-being of the child he had taken in. But every time he saw the headlines, heard the criticisms, or faced the judgment of his peers, he was reminded that his decision had not only changed his life, it had changed the narrative surrounding him. This was no longer just a story of a man helping a child in need, it was now a story about the price of compassion in a world that often preferred rules to empathy, and conformity to courage. Despite the mounting pressure, the judge refused to back down. In his heart, he knew that he had acted in the only way that felt right. But in the public eye, the judge was now an unwilling symbol of defiance, a man willing to face the wrath of the world for the sake of a child who needed him. And with each passing day, the weight of the judgment against him only grew heavier. In the quiet moments after the storm of public scrutiny, the judge took a deep breath and focused on the child in his care. Despite the overwhelming pressure from the media, colleagues, and even his own doubts, he knew that the boy deserved a life free from neglect, a chance to experience love and warmth. The boy, still adjusting to his new environment, clung to the judge as if he were the only anchor in an otherwise uncertain world. His small hands would grasp tightly at the judge's fingers, and his wide, innocent eyes searched for comfort in this strange new home. The judge, with a heart that had been hardened by years of legal battles, found himself slowly and gently opening to the idea of fatherhood. He had known that this decision would change his life, but he had not expected the transformation it would bring within him. The judge quickly learned how to balance his demanding career with the responsibilities of parenting. His colleagues, though still skeptical, began to notice a subtle shift in him. His stern demeanor softened when he spoke about the boy. He became more patient, more understanding, as if the child had unlocked a tenderness he never knew he had. He found joy in the small moments, helping the boy tie his shoes, teaching him to ride a bike, reading him bedtime stories. Each of these moments, once foreign to him, became treasures that filled a void he hadn't even realized was there. The home, once an empty place of silence after a long day at the courthouse, was now alive with the sound of laughter. The boy, who had been abandoned and left to wander the streets, now had a room filled with toys, books, and most importantly, love. The judge's house, which had once felt like a place of solitude, was now a warm and bustling home. Every meal shared, every bedtime story read, every simple gesture of care was a reminder of the bond they had forged, a bond that transcended bloodlines and expectations. But the challenges were far from over. The judge's decision had made him a target, and there were still many who questioned his ability to raise a child on his own, especially one so young and with such a difficult past. Some of his closest friends and family, though supportive of his decision, could not help but express their concerns. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" they would ask, their voices laced with uncertainty. But the judge knew, deep in his heart, that he was doing the right thing. The boy had become his world, and every challenge they faced together only made their bond stronger. There were sleepless nights when the boy cried for reasons he couldn't understand, but the judge held him through it all, offering comfort and reassurance. It was in those moments, when the boy would look up at him with tear-filled eyes, that the judge realized the profound responsibility he had taken on. It was not just about giving the boy a roof over his head, it was about giving him love, security, and the chance to grow into a confident, happy individual. Over time, the boy began to thrive. He spoke more, played more, and his once downtrodden spirit began to shine with hope. The judge, who had once been distant and detached, found himself fully invested in this little life that had become so important to him. They became a family, not by the traditional definitions of kinship, but by the power of love and choice. The judge's decision to adopt the boy had far-reaching consequences, but not just for the child. It had changed the judge as well. It had shown him the depths of his own humanity, the capacity for unconditional love and care that had been buried beneath years of legal proceedings and professional obligations. It had made him realize that, in the grand scheme of things, the law was important, but the well-being of a child was more important still. Their days were filled with the kind of simple, beautiful moments that made life worth living, the quiet mornings over breakfast, the evening walks in the park, and the comforting routines of bedtime. The boy's once empty life was now full of laughter, stability, and hope. As time passed, the boy's story became more than just a story of a judge who defied expectations. It became a story of love, of second chances, and of the transformative power of family. The judge had not just given the boy a home, he had given him a future. And in return, the boy had given the judge something he never knew he needed, a sense of purpose, a new reason to fight for what was right, and the unshakable belief that family is not defined by blood, but by the love and commitment shared between two people. Their journey was far from over, but in that moment, both the judge and the boy knew that they were exactly where they were meant to be, together, a family bound by love, against all odds. The boy had never known stability, never understood what it meant to have a home filled with warmth and safety. His early years had been defined by fear and abandonment, the harsh reality of life on the streets lurking at every corner. But now, in a room that was all his own, he lay quietly, feeling the soft sheets around him, the faint scent of comfort in the air, and the steady presence of the man who had made this life possible for him. His new father, the judge, stood by the window, looking out at the world with a contemplative gaze. The boy, now safe, had learned that love didn't need to be tied to blood. What mattered more than genetics or lineage was the bond they shared, one forged in the face of hardship and the simple yet profound act of choosing one another. It was in the small, quiet moments of their day-to-day life that the depth of their connection blossomed. In the mornings, the boy would run down the stairs with a smile as the judge prepared breakfast. They didn't need grand gestures or expensive gifts, it was enough to simply be there for each other. But the judge, a man of great authority and respect in his courtroom, found that fatherhood had opened his heart in ways he hadn't imagined. He learned to be patient, to listen when the boy wanted to tell him about his day, or when he needed comfort after a bad dream. Each evening, they would sit together on the couch, the boy nestled in his father's lap, reading stories from a book the judge had once read to his own children, before life had become all about courtrooms and legal papers. The bond between them grew, not out of obligation, but because they had found each other at the most crucial time in their lives. For the boy, it wasn't about remembering the pain he had endured, it was about learning to trust and love someone who cared for him in ways he had never imagined. And for the judge, it was a chance to embrace the kind of unconditional love he had never allowed himself to experience before. The boy had transformed from a scared, lonely child to a vibrant and happy little boy, his smile no longer clouded by fear or doubt. Their family, though unconventional in the eyes of many, was held together by something far stronger than the bloodline or societal expectations. It was held together by love, by the deep and unwavering bond that had been nurtured through acts of kindness, compassion, and shared experiences. The judge found strength in his decision. He had chosen a path not dictated by the world's prejudices, but by the simple truth that love could change a life. He had given the boy more than just a roof over his head, he had given him a future. And in return, the boy had filled a space in the judge's heart he didn't know was empty. Together, they built a new beginning, one day at a time. The boy's laughter echoed through the halls of their home, the sound of joy that had once seemed impossible now a constant reminder of their shared journey. The judge, who had once stood before a room full of people making decisions about the lives of others, now found himself in the most important role of all, a father. Their life together was just beginning. Each day brought new challenges, but also new triumphs. The boy was no longer defined by his past, but by the love he had found in his new father. And for the judge, this was the start of a new chapter, a chapter filled with the promise of family, of healing, and of the power of unconditional love. This was more than a new beginning for the boy, it was a new beginning for them both, and the start of a life that would be forever defined by the love they shared. If you want to hear more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to our channel and stay tuned for even more heartwarming tales.